All right, thanks everyone again for joining us tonight for the Linda Laurie Nature Foundation Science Pub. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's Science Pub speaker, who will be talking about climate adaptation and resilience in the northeastern U.S. fishing communities. So please help me welcome Dr. Katherine Maltby, Assistant Research Scientist with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Thank you, Kat, so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, thanks, Sarah. And hi, everyone. Let me just get my screen shared so you can all see it. So hopefully you can see that. And yeah, so hi. Thanks for giving up one of the first nice spring evenings. It's certainly here, sunny here in Maine, and I hope it is down there too. But yeah, I'm Kat. I'm a social scientist at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. So I've been here for around 5 years now, really researching how people and communities can cope and adjust with mounting climate impacts along our coastline. So I'll give a bit of a background as to some of the impacts that we've been seeing along the coast, and then diving into some of the strategies that people are using to adjust to those changes, before then finalizing with some kind of forward-looking ideas. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge that the work that I'll be presenting today isn't just done by me, but it's done by lots of others, both at GMRI as well as collaborators, particularly at NOAA. And this work is also funded by NOAA and the National Sea Grant Programme. So their support is vital for science. And I also just want to mention that the work that I'm presenting really wouldn't be possible without the time and inputs from fishermen and other fishery stakeholders that we've worked with over the years within the region. And so a big thank you for them making it happen. So to start with a bit of background, so Northeast fishing communities are experiencing a whole range of different impacts from climate change. So really undergoing a sea of change, and I'll just highlight some of those key kind of hazards that people are experiencing. The first, which you probably are aware of, is rising sea temperatures. So within the Gulf of Maine region, we're seeing kind of really rapid rates of warming along our coastline, much higher and faster rates compared to the broader ocean. So in the past, since the late 1980s, we've seen rates of warming at around 0.84 Fahrenheit per decade, which that may not sound very much, but for marine life, that's a really substantial increase. And we're really expecting to see continued kind of rates of warming into the future. These are also punctuated by kind of more extreme heat wave events that can happen as well. A common one, or a famous one, I guess, was in 2012 in Maine, which really affected the lobster industry there and affected really the prices that were held at market. And then just on that globe picture there, seeing kind of that warming, we are seeing a lot of warming across the whole Northeast region that's occurred. Alongside rising sea temperatures, we've also been seeing rising sea levels. So I just am showing a graph there of Portland, Maine sea level rise in more recent years. Sorry, I don't have a Nantucket specific one, but maybe someone in the audience does know the rates. But since kind of the mid-1990s, we've seen rates of around 0.12 feet per decade of sea level rise in Portland, and seeing kind of that backdrop for a broader length of time. A lot of that sea level rise has been contributed due to that warming sea temperature, alongside kind of mounting glacier runoff and melting sea ice. And so at a global level, also seeing that sea level rise of around 6.5 inches since the 1901, I think. And then sort of another key hazard affecting coastal communities is that of storm events and coastal flooding. So there's a lot of uncertainty around kind of how storms will change in terms of their frequency or severity. But sea level rise is really interacting with storm events to mean that the coastal flooding that occurs is much more significant and impactful for people to experience. So last January, you may remember, there was a lot of storm events that happened, two quite significant ones within the Northeast, and in Maine particular, really heavily hit and affected the working waterfront. So estimates suggest that around 60% of working waterfront in Maine was either impacted, damaged, or lost as a result of those storm events. So that's just a range of some of the hazards that are affecting fishing communities from a physical perspective. But of course, these then manifest into impacts on marine life and fishery resources. So this can include impacts on the distribution of key fish stocks that are either targeted currently or have been historically. So with warming sea temperatures, species shifting a lot further north into colder and deeper waters. Also, things like the productivity of fish stocks can be affected. So things like sort of reproductive rates, growth rates, mortality rates affected by changes in sea temperatures. And ocean acidification, which I haven't mentioned, but that can also affect shell-forming organisms, things like oysters and mussels or clams, through affecting the integrity of those shells. And the changing environment also affects timing of key life cycle events and when certain prey may be available to a particular species. And so that, of course, also affects predator-prey interactions, and with species distribution shifts, we're also seeing changes in the dynamics between different types of populations that are new to different areas. And then finally, there's also potential for increasing diseases and pathogens affecting species. So, for example, lobster shell disease has been thought to be increasingly prevalent in some lobsters due to rising sea temperatures. So they're just some of the physical and ecological impacts, but really where my research's focus is really understanding how people are adjusting and being impacted by these climate change stresses. So this picture here, I recently found that it's in a paper and I really quite like how it depicts different aspects of social economic considerations within fisheries, right from sort of people's needs to prepare to fish and thinking about gear and fishing grounds, through to kind of family, personal well-being and community level effects. So I'll just kind of frame out some of the changes that we're seeing from more of a social and economic perspective on fishing communities. So changes in the species distributions and their abundances, of course, is meaning that there's altered catch compositions and availability of species for different types of fisheries. This can also lead to people having to change some of their fishing behavior. So in some fisheries, such as the lobster fishery, we're seeing some people having to fish further offshore into some of those cooler, deeper waters where there's greater biomass of lobsters. Fishermen's safety and their ability to fish can also be affected by changing storminess. If there's a change in the frequency or severity of those storms, then kind of you can't actually get out to fish. And also if you think about if you're having to fish further offshore, changes in sort of fishing efforts can also be affected and affect people's health and safety. Changes in those catch compositions and availability trickle up to affect supply chains in terms of what species might be handled and processed. How can we utilize underutilized species within supply chains to adjust to some of those changes? Things like storm events or coastal flooding can affect key transportation routes of getting seafood to market. And as I mentioned before, heat wave events can also affect some species. So in 2012, there were dramatic price impacts due to some of the lobster dynamics that happened there. Changing sea level rise, both long-term and also coastal flooding events, as well as storms, can affect the infrastructure and working waterfronts within fishing communities, both causing short-term damage as well as longer-term repairs that might be needed and adjustments to raise infrastructure above kind of sea level rise estimates. And then what I've termed here of kind of more hidden social and cultural impacts. So these are things that might not be immediately visible to the eye, but are also really important to be considering. So things like people's identity and attachment to fishing as a way of life rather than just an occupation can be eroded if a species, for example, is starting to decline or not be as prevalent in a region. Other impacts can include things like anxiety and stress that comes along with having to think about how to actually adapt and plan out your future within fishing, given all of these changes that you're experiencing. And so finally, another impact that we're seeing is these livelihood adjustments and diversifications, and that's really where a lot of my research has been focused. So due to this kind of range of impacts that fishing communities are experiencing, resilience within fishery system has really risen up sort of the agenda, both from science, practice, and policy perspectives. And so this slide just kind of shows, I just kind of went to different websites and selected kind of all these different terms that allude to building resilience or supporting resilience and encouraging resilience in fishing communities or fisheries along the coastline. But we really need to do a little bit more digging to think about what does resilience actually mean? And when we say building or supporting resilience, what does that actually look like for different people, fisheries, and places? So I'm just going to dig a little bit into the theory of resilience. Don't worry, I won't go too deep, but I think it's important just to kind of ground us as to how I think about these issues. So I kind of am from a social ecological perspective with my research, really looking at human systems and ecosystems being really interconnected with one another. But I really focus on the human system part of a fishery. So that can be a range of different scales from individual fishermen up to supply chain businesses, things like dealers and processors, through to communities. So different communities have different reliances on fishing and have different initiatives going on to support climate action, as well as then thinking about the governance and management level as well. So those are the kind of rules and regulations and policies that might be in place that can govern adaptation and resilience within a system. And so climate resilience, kind of researching it and thinking about it and enacting it really involving lots of different actors and also thinking about lots of different scales. So not just the social scale, but also temporal scales. How do we balance sort of day-to-day decision-making and business perspectives alongside multi-decadal timeframes? Doing this kind of work also involves examining and understanding the unique context for individuals or for communities, as well as trying to kind of bridge those broader trends and understandings of kind of across places. And importantly, resilience can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, which merits kind of digging in and understanding it more. And so I think this all really matters because how we understand and ultimately frame resilience has really direct consequences, not just on the types of futures that we work towards, but also the strategies and decisions and policies that are used to help people and nature adjust to climate and environmental change. So to understand resilience in fishing communities, I use a couple of different lenses. The first is really to think about the pathways. So how are people responding to climate or environmental change, and what do different resilience strategies look like for different people? I then also layer that with understanding about the conditions and context. So what influences people's ability to make a change? What factors might enable or inhibit adaptation and resilience? And then finally, thinking about the needs. So what resources or systems are needed to support climate resilience? And what is the role of different actors in helping support adaptation? And so I'll just drill into a couple of case studies, firstly of the American lobster fishery, which is where a lot of my research has been focused, as well as then kind of zooming out a little bit into broader scale studies. And just quickly to note and acknowledge that although here I'm focused on climate change, our fishing communities along the northeast are facing a whole bunch of different changes and things that are happening aside from climate change. This includes offshore wind developments, right whale regulations, greying of the fleet, which means unfortunately a lot of the fishing community is more of senior age with fewer new entrants. We're also seeing challenges to working waterfront access, rising costs of fishing, and of course people are also undergoing their own lives and so have household considerations to make. So let's dive into the southern New England lobster fishery as a case study. So for those that aren't aware exactly where the southern New England lobster fishery is, it kind of extends down from southern Mass down to North Carolina, but really the majority of landings these days really happen within Connecticut through to southern Massachusetts. Sorry, there's a lag between my mouse clicker and the slides. So over time, this fishery has kind of been in a bit of a decline state. So since the late 90s and early 2000s, we've seen declines in both the abundance of lobster alongside declines in lobster landings kind of throughout that region. And this is in comparison to the Gulf of Maine, where we've seen landings kind of really increase in more recent years. There's been a lot of different factors that have been attributed to some of these lobster population declines. And I should note that kind of in combination with this kind of more steady decline, and the state of the stock is kind of at a low but stable state right now. But we have seen also periodic die-off events, which are kind of mass mortality events. So the most significant of those was in 1999 in the Long Island Sound. So really dramatically hit the New York and Connecticut industry in particular. That was kind of an overnight sort of event where a large amount of the lobster stock was lost. And so, yeah, multiple factors have been suggested to have caused these declines and these die-off events, ranging from warming sea temperatures and anomalous kind of hypoxic events, as well as particularly the fishing industry strongly believes that water quality issues, particular pesticides, have also contributed to die-off events within the lobster population. But my work really isn't looking at those factors. It's really more about what do we know about how lobstermen have responded to these declines, because actually there's very little research out there about that. So my work has been how have and are people responding to these declines? What's influenced how people are able to undertake those responses? And then what can we learn to inform resilience planning, both in southern New England, but also up in Maine, where the lobster stock is under increasing uncertainty due to changing environment. So firstly, I undertook a news analysis. So I was able to extract stories about 76 individuals who have experienced those lobster declines and really focus on sort of understanding some of the livelihood adjustments. And we could identify 3 general response categories across those people. The first, we found that a number of people sort of chose to stay lobstering full time despite kind of declines in lobster catches. So really kind of encapsulating resilience as persistability and coping strategies. So many kind of showing changes in fishing practices, perhaps fishing in different areas or changing soak times or other aspects of their kind of fishing behavior to try and buffer some of those declines in catches. But often people were reliant on having financial buffers, things like savings, loans, or financial aid to assist them during those declines. A larger proportion of people we found kind of fell into this more adapt category. So still choosing to lobster part-time, but also altering to either fish part-time for other species, things like conch or whelk, Jonah crab, black sea bass, a whole host of different things, clamming, I think, as well, or choosing to work part-time outside of the fishery in either a marine-based job or in something completely different from fishing, things like construction or other manual labour, for example. And then finally, we also saw a number of people kind of take this more transformational route of exiting lobstering completely to move into another fishery completely, or exiting lobstering to move into another job or business. And in some cases, this meant physically moving to another area to pursue a different job or livelihood. So that work was really great in giving a bit of a understanding at a general level, but I really wanted to learn more and kind of speak to people firsthand about their experiences. So the next part of my project really involved going out and speaking to both current lobstermen within the fishery, as well as trying to track down some people that had left the industry, whether recently or quite a while ago. And so this involved both in-person and phone interviews. Unfortunately, I didn't make it to Nantucket, but maybe in a future project I can make it there. But yeah, these were really, really pivotal conversations that I had, and I learned so much from those. But I'll just be reporting here on the ones south of New Hampshire. So from those interviews, we could really dig a little bit deeper and find that when people are facing change, it's not just about how they kind of adjusted their livelihoods, which is what I've just really been discussing then, but also a lot about kind of people's individual and collective sense of agency. And so a lot of the resilience narratives that we hear in fisheries at the moment is always focused on livelihoods, but we can also open that dialogue to include other responses and strategies. So this included people taking legal action. So this really involved a lot of the New York and Connecticut lobstermen who kind of tried to hold pesticide companies to account for their kind of belief that that's what had caused the die-off event within Long Island Sound. Other lobstermen kind of grouped together to protest a variety of different regulations that the state was kind of implementing due to the declines in the lobster stock. There are also examples of the industry and scientists collaborating to understand more about kind of why the lobsters have been in a state of decline and providing more data to inform regulation decisions. And then we also see examples of lobstermen getting more involved in management decision-making processes to try and influence and provide their knowledge to those situations. And so really kind of seeing lobstermen in the industry not just kind of undertaking actions to mitigate their own vulnerability to future change, but also that of the broader fishery. And so this is really important. Centralizing agency within resilience discussions recognizes that people are active agents. They're not just sort of passively experiencing climate or environmental change. We also found from this work that responses are evolving and they're not discrete. So people were undertaking a whole range of different responses at similar or different times. And they weren't just kind of going from one step to the other in a pre-formulated plan. And importantly, thinking about resilience and agency together, we can find that there's a number of different factors that affected both of those things at a range of scales. And so I'll just talk about some of them now. So firstly, thinking back to that diagram where I showed from the sort of the individual fisherman up to the governance level, that's kind of the scales that we're going to be going through now. So when we talk to fishermen at about sort of individual contexts and conditions affecting their responses that they made over time. One of the key things that people talked about was their age and family considerations. So older lobstermen feeling that they didn't necessarily have as many different skills or different options at their kind of life stage compared to those that were younger within the fishery. And also those that were younger within the fishery having to kind of plan out a much longer career compared to those that maybe only have 5 or 10 years in it. And family considerations, meaning kind of those younger fishermen also having to think about raising their young families and supporting them over time. People also discussed how fishing wasn't just sort of a livelihood, but also a real way of life, a way of upholding for some family traditions and heritage, and really formed an integral part of their identity. And so having to navigate whether to stay within the lobster fishery despite declining catches or whether to leave and do something else really kind of got at people's core personal well-being. People's financial flexibility also plays a role. Making changes to a business is very expensive, and having access to loans or savings or financial aid really quite pivotal for some people over others as to what kind of options might be available. And then finally, fisheries capital, which really by this term I mean the sort of knowledge, experience, and skills that is needed by people in order for them to be able to switch into other types of fisheries. It's not that simple to switch a lobster boat to potentially catch clams or dig for clams, for example, or get black sea bass or other types of species. And so that really involves a whole lot of different knowledge and skills in order for people to do that. At the industry level, kind of this really speaks to some of the collective agency pieces that we heard about. So over time, there was a lot of changing industry dynamics as they were navigating these lobster declines. Unfortunately, a lot of people did leave the industry, and so there's fewer individuals collectively. And so people talked about the loss of some of their social relationships and connections with people. Others said that because there were fewer of them together, that they felt a stronger sense of connection with one another. But many also lamented how some of their lobstering associations had become less powerful over time in terms of influence on management decision making, because there were fewer of them to collectively have one voice within those processes. And then those industry dynamics also affected by fewer crew and fewer new entrants into the industry, which lobstermen kind of attributed to a whole range of different factors. But yeah, I won't go into all of those. Kind of moving up another level and thinking about some of the community and waterfront contexts and conditions affecting both sort of individual and collective agency. So people talked a lot about how over time the working waterfront has really changed in terms of what shoreside services are available, in terms of people's access, and in terms of also what's kind of viewed as acceptable by kind of other community members who aren't associated with fishing. So kind of really important for people to be able to have continued working waterfront access in order to have those long-term planning horizons to think about, well, if I want to diversify into another fishery, can I even do that if there's not a local net maker nearby? Or if I'm going to have to source equipment from up in Maine, for example. There were some really great examples and of kind of some of the initiatives that the industry have undertaken. So in Newport in Rhode Island, for example, the Lobster Shack is really a co-op design, which has really enabled lobstermen to sort of club together, really put lobster and the fishing community on the map for that town, despite kind of increasing pressures from other kind of coastal uses, things like condos or hotels. And they found that that's been a really effective model for them to sort of get increased value from lobster and the catches that they're landing, but also to promote local seafood within their community. Community perceptions of fishing can also influence sort of some of those changing pressures and uses on the working waterfront, different types of access that people view as acceptable or not. And people also, lobstermen that I was talking to, particularly those on Long Island in New York, saying that due to a combination of some of the community perceptions not being favourable of fishing communities and also losing working waterfront access, they weren't able to actually store their traps on land when kind of those lobster declines were happening. And so actually a lot of lobstermen had to leave their traps out in the water, and some of those traps are still being collected today, even though it's, over 20 years ago. And so that's kind of an example of where community perceptions and changing working waterfront access and pressures kind of comes together and affects people's choices that they make. Finally, we can also look at some of the institutional level, so the management and governance effects on the system. So lobstermen talked about how regulations could be quite inflexible and prevent them from being able to really easily move into other types of fisheries that they might have wanted to pursue. And that's a kind of issue that we hear a lot from a range of different fishermen in different types of fisheries across the Northeast. There's also a lot of tension between differences in the perceptions of causes of declines between industry and science and management. And so that's affected some of the trust, I think, particularly in the early sort of 2000s period in sort of decision-making processes. And coupled with that, lobstermen also felt that they were unheard in some of the decision-making processes around regulations and things. But we have seen a lot of increase in industry science partnerships, as I was mentioning before, which provide new ways for different kinds of stakeholders to work together to really kind of push forward understanding of declines in the lobster fishery there. So what can we learn for resilience planning just at a general level? Well, firstly, resilience really isn't a static goal, which is often kind of, we hear a lot of narratives that, we'll build resilience, and that feels like quite a specific goal in time. But really, resilience is something that's inherently dynamic and multi-scale and constantly changing. Resilience planning also needs to account for and support heterogeneity in behaviours and choices. So as people encounter different types of environmental and climate change, how do we enable different types of strategies and responses to occur simultaneously rather than directing people down potentially maladaptive routes? And then finally, really fostering agency is as important as livelihood-focused initiatives. So not just focusing on kind of supporting people into another job or into another fishery, but also supporting things like leadership and building knowledge and trust. So just to kind of give another case study to some of the work that we've been doing, more from a resilience planning perspective, to understand barriers and enablers of action within Northeast fishing communities. So this was some work that we did a couple of years ago, which was where we interviewed a number of folks and did workshops with people from Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, really to think about what factors might hinder or help the implementation of resilient strategies. So kind of there's a real gap between knowledge about climate impacts and then actual action on climate impacts. And so trying to dig into what some of those factors can be that affects that. And so just really broadly, we identified a number of different barriers across different levels of the fishery system, as I was talking about before. So things like the increased specialization and overcapitalization of many fishermen within particular fisheries. So this was particularly around lobster and in some cases scallop. It's really a lot to invest in those types of fisheries, and people become very specialized on them, which can make them more vulnerable to future shocks or changes to that fishery. Issues such as I've just described at the working waterfront were mentioned by a lot of different folks, and also the need for kind of similar actions higher up in the supply chain. So a fisherman might diversify into another fishery and catch different species, but if there isn't a dealer and a harvester and ultimately a consumer to kind of really provide that demand for that different species, then there's kind of a bit of a barrier there across those scales. We also identified a number of different enablers, things like knowledge and learning, being able to foster knowledge exchange between different types of stakeholders, not just between groups, so between industry members, but between industry and science or industry and management, really important. Being able to have provisions to protect the working waterfront and also really investing in having a diversity of shoreside services can really assist people in making their choices about their future their futures within the fishing industry rather than having to potentially leave it. Importantly, many of these that we found aren't necessarily unique to climate change itself. And so potentially, thinking about these from not just a climate change lens, but at the start I mentioned all of those other changes that people are experiencing within fishing communities. How do some of these barriers and enablers affect kind of people's ability to make change based on those other stresses that they're experiencing? And often some of these stem from historical changes within the fishery. So that specialization and overcapitalization example that I just gave kind of stems a lot from some of the groundfish declines that we have seen within the region. and have kind of meant that a lot of people have had to fish on a fewer amount of species. And importantly, these findings help to underscore the importance of multi-scale approaches and actions across fishery systems, and we really need kind of more of a holistic approach to thinking about resilience planning. So coming towards the end of the talk now, think about, well, how can we support the resilience of fishing communities going forwards? So for us as scientists and working at GMRI, one of the key aspects that we've been focused on, and a challenge that we've recognized, is that there's a lot of different resources out there for climate change in general, or that's focused on coasts or fisheries generally, but fishing community specific information is often lacking or falls through the gaps. And so in recent work, we developed a climate adaptation resource hub for fishing communities as a way to bring together different types of information that our lab and others at GMRI, as well as others across the region, have been producing into kind of one platform to bring that together. So we have ecological projections information alongside the social research that I was just presenting, and present that in a more localized format. So we frame that around this climate adaptation planning pathway, which is a pretty standard pathway in adaptation and resilience planning and decision making more generally. So really kind of orientating people into, why adaptation can be important, and the importance of setting goals and incorporating aspects such as equity and public participation within those processes. Then we have information around some of the climate hazards that I was describing at the start, and also some of the climate impacts on fisheries. And that's really downscaled, particularly into the northeast. So that map there on the left shows reports that we have for around 16 communities right now, where we've kind of delved into not just historical changes that have happened within the fisheries, but also projections of future changes for different species. And then the rest of the site also has information on some of the different work we've been doing around sort of livelihood adjustments, adaptation options, and barriers and enablers to resilience planning. So more generally going forwards, resilience planning and action is already underway in a lot of our coastal and fishing communities within the Northeast, but that looks very different depending on fishery and depending on the community. And so really when we talk about resilience planning, it's really important to consider local context and needs. Importantly, I think there's a critical need for more integrated efforts and management that can connect actions across different scales, so that we don't kind of initiatives at one scale don't pose a barrier to initiatives at another scale, and that we collectively can push people forwards in the right direction. Increasingly emphasizing resilience as an evolving process is, I think, important rather than as a static goal in time. It's much more effective and really kind of truer to people's lived experiences that are experiencing a really changing and dynamic environment. And then finally, approaches that aren't just focused on sort of livelihood adjustments, but also focus on agency, fostering learning, providing the opportunity for creativity and innovation, which we see a lot already within the fishing community. But really emphasizing that, I think, is really needed for continued momentum to address climate change. So I just wanted to finish with ideas for supporting resilience of your own fishing community or those that you might go and visit. I know that this can feel quite big and high scale, but individual action also is important in this. So taking part in community climate initiatives can be a really great way to have your own voice heard within those decisions, and also for providing kind of viewpoints and values around fishing specifically, which can sometimes get lost in those conversations. Simply getting to know your working waterfront, knowing the people and the businesses there can help understand kind of the value for why we need to preserve that access and enable that diversity of shoreside services to exist for communities going forwards. Getting involved in different community science programs is also a great way to get localized science and data into kind of broader scale initiatives. And then finally, kind of an easy one, I think, is just trying different types of local seafood aside from sort of the traditional favorites. So kind of trying to eat some of those more underutilized species and providing demand for them provides kind of a route for fishermen to sort of diversify into those, knowing that there might be a market available for them. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you for listening, and happy to take any questions, or you can also email me at a later point in time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. As I always say, this is like the downside of a webinar is you don't get to hear people clap at the end. You're like, I'm done. Thank you so much. I feel like, well, first I want to say to everyone, if you please put any questions in the chat or in the Q&A for Kat. And I have a few questions myself, but like please ask away. But I really think, Kat, I really appreciated your talk tonight. I think there were a lot of commonalities and similarities that we could draw for our Nantucket working waterfront. And I appreciated the action-oriented, you know, what things individuals can do at the end. One of the things I was struck by was something that you said about diversification, especially with the lobster industry. Obviously, it's a really highly specialized equipment and skill set, but also with the traps and, you know, and it's really hard to convert. How have you seen that diversification actually work for many people, or is it, I mean, I know you wove this into your talk that diversification can be a positive benefit, but I'm just curious because we have some of those specialized fisheries here as well.
Yeah, so diversification is definitely one of probably the maybe easier options for people to take in terms of it can uphold that sense of identity and still fishing and being part of a working waterfront fishing community compared to potentially like having to leave the industry, for example. But yeah, I guess I was saying it's also difficult because of the regulatory constraints that can, you know, really inhibit people being able to easily move into another fishery, as well as just the knowledge and skills that is required. But yeah, there was a lot of successful stories from the lobstermen that I've interviewed, and here up in Maine, we've seen a lot of people moving into some of the kelp farming in the off season as a way to supplement some of their income, and trying to reduce reliance on lobstering. I guess there's some concern within older parts of the industry that younger fishermen haven't sort of lived through the experiences of a dynamic fishery within Maine. It's always kind of been more on the upward slope for many of the younger entrants, and so they might not have as much of the knowledge and experiences of having to diversify into other fisheries historically because of that. But kind of more in the southern New England context, there's been a lot of success, particularly around moving into the Jonah crab fishery, kind of some lobstermen also moving into black sea bass, which I think has a bit of a different regulatory requirements, and so was a one that was easier to transition into. And yeah, so I think diversification is for a lot of people the route that they like to take really, and I think that comes down to sort of the identity and being able to still have an attachment to the water.
Thank you. Yeah, I think diversification and reducing specialization is something that can be a good advice across all industries, whether it's fisheries or other aspects of resiliency, right? We say that a lot. The diversity of our habitats are important for resiliency, the diversity of this type of work too. There's a question about what are some of the non-traditional seafoods that you're aware of in Maine, where fishermen are trying to create new markets. You mentioned kelp in particular, but are there other kind of non-traditional seafoods that you're thinking of?
Yeah, I would say kelp's probably one of the main ones. I think some of the ground fish, although that's like pretty regulated and also not as abundant as it once were. green crabs. I'm not sure if it's necessarily lobstermen that have been diversifying specifically into them, but green crabs have been kind of an increasingly invasive species. And so there's been a lot of efforts in the state to kind of get more people, well, not just people, but chefs and people innovating for how to make them kind of yummy. So I was reading about a sauce at the weekend that people have made, as well as I think there's some burger ideas for a soft shell crab. So yeah, they're just a couple of them. But in season kind of species that you can be eating right now includes scallops, urchins, white hake and flounders, I think. Yeah, but they're not
Yeah.
necessarily the ones that people have transitioned into.
Right, and you actually answered this a little bit, but someone asked about what about some of the invasive species, specifically green crabs, as you mentioned. We've definitely have those on Nantucket, and we've different organizations have done a similar effort of we have Green Crab Week where we're trying to, I think, make stock and different things from green crabs, and I think there was a fertilizer made from green crabs, so it is a big effort. Also lionfish, as Kitty mentioned. We don't have I don't know how if we've had lionfish up here yet. Have you had lionfish up yet in
I don't, I wouldn't want to be on the record, but I don't think so. Or I'm not
yeah.
aware that we've seen any yet, but yeah, maybe.
I did attend an invasive species dinner in DC where lionfish was on the menu. It was quite
Okay,
interesting,
well.
but it was farther south, much further south. Um, I did have a question too. One of the things that you were talking about was about the shoreside services, and I think that's really important, obviously, to support the different work of different fisheries and different industries. Um, have you noticed or have part of your work involved the economics of those shoreside services? So one of the things that we're experiencing on Nantucket is that many of the shoreside services, as you mentioned, are kind of dissipating because of the real estate, of that shorefront are, so even though there's dockage and there's spaces for the boats, but maybe some of the ship chandlery and, some of the support services are waning.
Yeah, that's a key thing, and a lot of lobstermen that I interviewed talked about that, and other fisheries stakeholders that we've worked with in other projects. Increasingly seeing a lot of key areas becoming like, the sort of hubs for a lot of that infrastructure. So New Bedford, for example, being one of those areas where there's still quite a lot of different shoreside services available. And Point Judith, Rhode Island, well, I guess Port of Galilee, also having a diversity of shoreside services, which have really been important for the fishing industry there to kind of enable them to try different fisheries, knowing that they can get some of that, gear or whatever kind of other services that they need to support those transitions. So I think the tough piece is once it's sort of lost, it's then really hard to get it back. But yeah, I mean, some of the people that I've been to on Long Island, for example, we're still having to go up to Maine to source equipment, or, having to just fly it in from somewhere online. And so, yeah, haven't done like specific economic studies on that, but know that has an effect. And of course, all of those jobs and, the employment that provides, also lost when that goes away. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying, because as a community member and living on an island, and my husband is a charter fisherman, so we think about these things, and we do a lot. I haven't thought about these aspects though in terms of like our resilience planning for the community. So much of what we think about is like the physical space of sea level rise, erosion, and storm surge, and that kind of thing. It's really interesting thinking about being able to incorporate many aspects of the economics of our community.
Yeah, and yeah, I think from that work that's really come out, which we didn't necessarily think about, was like, working waterfront access is a real key climate resilience sort of strategy. And I think it's also a reflection of how, I sort of alluded to it, how kind of management and governance is currently sort of, a lot of the fisheries management is just focused on the ecology of the stock and the fish itself. And some of those more social and economic elements aren't really within fisheries management remits. Then when you look at sort of coastal remits, that's a lot more about sea level rise, and that's about physical space, but not necessarily recognizing the value of fishing within that. And so how do we sort of take a more holistic approach and get different policies to work with one another to support both of those needs? Yeah, but it gets really tricky, and there's so many different policies and things and regulations to think about.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think bringing it up in terms of resiliency planning in our case, our town and county level is a really important thing, just to even, as we continually talk about what are the important parts of our, we talk about community character a lot here, and I think part of that is that working waterfront. So there's a question: working waterfronts seem to be disappearing. How do we support the economics and the value of fisheries to our communities? So how can we support these working waterfront communities that we value?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I don't have all the answers, but I think supporting local seafood and eating local seafood where you can, and trying to get that invested back into the local economy, getting to know your working waterfront. So in Portland, for example, there's a really great public event once a year where it really encourages all different types of businesses and public to come and interact with one another to just foster understanding of, you know, what's down there. Sometimes there can be spaces that you don't really want to walk down, or maybe feel a bit intimidated to be down there, because you don't know if you're allowed down there, for example. But yeah, getting to know what those spaces look like and involve, and then taking that knowledge and thinking about that value to some of those maybe community climate initiatives or decision-making processes that are happening in your town, and, you know, speaking up for working waterfront and fishing communities within those contexts. Sometimes they can be left out of the table. So I think there's some ways, but yeah, if others have ideas, I'm curious to hear them too.
Great, thank you. Just so you know, there are a few people have asked if we offer a certificate after this program. We don't offer a certificate after this program, but if there's something someone would like me to sign that you attended, you can email me. So I'm going to put my personal email in the chat. But a few people have asked that, so I just want to make sure if you're watching and you're hoping for getting credit for this, if there's something that I could do to give you credit, I would be happy to say that you attended. Sorry, I'm typing. Okay,
Yeah.
that's my email if anyone as the host, that I can provide that for you. Are there any other questions from the audience right now? I know there's someone had asked about the working waterfront. Okay. Brad, you raised your hand. If you can type what you want to say into the chat, just because we're on a webinar, we're not often. Okay. Hopefully I've answered that for Brad. Great. Well, I am really interested in this work, Kat, and I think this is really resonates with us here on Nantucket, both with our working waterfront. I happen personally to sit on our town's coastal resiliency advisory committee, and I feel like as a scientist, but I also try to speak up where I can for the working waterfront. And I think adding in discussions of support services for that is really important too. I know as you're saying with the regulations, some of the regulations changed with COVID obviously state to state, the regulations are very different for both fishing and what you were able to sell off your boat. And so the lobstermen were able to do like day lobsters you could sell, some people could sell, but other fisheries, other industries do need that market to sell to. They can't sell right off the boat. So it's really interesting what as you said, that the regulations may be hampering some of the ability to diversify or to kind of meet the needs or to be a little bit more resilient as a business owner too. So it's really interesting. Cool. Well, thank you, Kat, again for being here. And thank you everyone for being here this evening with us. I am going to, once again, I'm going to end the recording shortly, and I'll be sending the recording to everyone else. If you have follow-up questions, you can either email me, my email's right there, and I can send them to Kat, or Kat did leave her email earlier in the presentation and said you're open to additional questions if there's anything that you'd like to ask. So thank you so much again for being here.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's really great.
All right.